The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So I am Vanessa Santella, Operations Coordinator at the Orillia Museum of Art and History. Welcome to the fall edition of the OMAH-History Speaker Series organized by OMAH and the History Committee. We hope you had a great summer. We thank you for your support, and as always, we acknowledge Deanne McCallum at Rogers for sharing the OMAH Speaker Series on Rogers Cable Network. Thank you so much for all that you do, Deanne. In gathering information on those who previously attended OMAH's History Speaker Series, there was a large interest to learn about Orillia's industrial past. As a result, tonight we welcome John Smith of the Orillia Heritage Center, a group whose goal is to commemorate and celebrate Orillia's rich industrial history. Tonight, John will share his knowledge about the Tudhope Carriage Company and Tudhope Motor Company, as well as a wide array of goods manufactured in the factory at the corner of West and Colborne Streets. John Smith was born into an antique car family in Orillia, and he's been involved with locally built cars ever since. He has a particular interest in the automobiles built by Tudhope and more broadly, Orillia's industrial heritage. Over to you, John.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So, I've called this Orillia, Detroit of the North. And it's all about, it all starts with a blacksmith from Oro Township. So, I'm just having, oh, there we go. All right. I was introduced to Tudhope Cars and Tudhope Industries by my late father, Gordon Smith, who was, among other things, one of the first collectors of antique cars in Canada. A lifelong car enthusiast, he came to Orillia to found radio station CFOR, but he was already aware that automobiles were built here. He started looking for locally built cars, and at the peak of his collecting, owned 4 of them, including this 1912 Tudhope Touring. And just for the record, that's me on my mother's knee in this shot taken on Bay Street in Gravenhurst in 1953. In 1967, I drove that same car in a big parade celebrating both Canada's and Orillia's centennials. 16 years old, I had just failed my first attempt at getting my driver's license, but that didn't faze my dad. I was also unable to shift gears on the car, which really also wasn't helpful. Anyway, I made it through the parade, and at the end, I was breathing a sigh of relief when a guy about my age approached the car. Turned out it was Tim Spencer, a great-grandson of J.B. Tudhope, and he was accompanied by Andy Tudhope, a much older cousin. Understandably, they were both very interested in the car, and I felt I needed to offer them a ride. I'm sure I set their teeth on edge as I crunched through the gears in the non-synchromesh transmission, but it couldn't have affected things too much because Tim and I quickly became fast friends. Through him, I started to learn a lot more about the history of the Tudhope Industries and their impact on the community, and our mutual interest in this fascinating piece of local history continues to this day. And I think, in fact, he's watching tonight. I hope he is. Well, where to start? It has to be with William Tudhope, who was born in South Lanarkshire, Scotland in 1831. and emigrated to Canada with his parents and 8 siblings. The family settled on a farm on the 10th line of Oro Township, but it was anything but smooth sailing for them. By the time William was 3 years old, both his parents had died. George, the oldest of the children and just 18 years old at the time, took on the responsibility for keeping the family together. Their nearest neighbors were 2 miles away, and services were few and far between. Essentially, there were no opportunities for any of the children to attend school. Somehow, William ended up spending part of his boyhood with a Dr. Darling, who lived on Manitoulin Island. And later still, he learned the art of the craft of blacksmithing. And after a stay in Batavia, New York, in 1854, he returned to the 10th line, where he opened his own shop, making iron hardware, harness, and wagon parts. By 1876, he had relocated to a site on Andrew Street in Orillia, where he expanded into building horse-drawn carriages of all types. He called his business the Tudhope Carriage Company, and he became known for his excellent craftsmanship. William, in addition to being skilled in his trade, was a visionary. With the advent of the railway across the country, he traveled throughout Canada, setting up a network of sales agents. This soon resulted in excellent sales and an ongoing expansion of the plant's capacity. Tudhope products made in the late 19th to mid 20th century were marketed and sold literally coast to coast. These days, you can find examples of their carriages, automobiles, farm machinery, and much more in museums and private collections in virtually every province. Here's an illustration from an early Tudhope sales catalog. These catalogs came out annually, and they were about 1/4 of an inch thick with a different model or option on almost every page. A potential customer could choose from a dizzying range of styles and options. Shown here is a pretty basic 2-passenger buggy with optional top. I'd like to show you some of my favorite examples of Tudhope carriages and cutters, now in the collection of the Simcoe County Museum. Here we see a pretty basic 2-passenger buggy with optional top, like the one in the catalog illustration. This one has been lovingly and accurately restored, vibrant in authentic red and black paint. Here's one that really tickles my fancy. The original crossover vehicle. Known as a Democrat, it had removable seats, so it could function as a wagon or a delivery vehicle, but you could also put both seats in place and take the family to church on Sunday. And here we thought SUVs were the original crossovers. This cutter is one of the fancier offerings. Note that it has doors and a top, and you can't see it, but it's got beautiful plush blue velvet upholstery, or blue mohair rather, making it relatively cozy for a crisp winter ride. A young man coming to pick up his lady friend would cut quite the swath in this elegant vehicle. A Corvette or Mustang? Who needs them? Can you see the fancy striping on all the body panels? There were men employed to do nothing but apply striping, all done by hand, and likely with a fair amount of artistic license. It's doubtful the details would be exactly the same from one vehicle to the next. I wonder if anyone in tonight's audience knew Dr. Ross Andrews, a local chiropractor and musician. Charlie, his father, got his start in the working world as a striper at Tudhope's and later worked his way up to being plant foreman. Besides stripers, other specialized craftsmen were part of the Tudhope team. In addition to the obvious wood and metal workers, there were painters who applied paint and varnish, all by hand, no spraying, and trimmers who installed very high quality upholstery and top coverings using only the very best materials available. I remember my father, with his antique cars, having work done by former Tudhope trimmer Doug McKinnon on an ancient sewing machine in the basement of his Albert Street home. Doug's daughter Isabel, wife of local businessman Cowden Whitfield, just passed away a few years ago. I tell you about William, who passed away in 1900, because I believe he deserves the credit for establishing the Tudhope name across the country and ramping up production exponentially to meet sales. Often his sons, and in particular company president James Brockett Tudhope, or JB as he was known, are seen as putting the Tudhope Carriage Company on the map. Not to diminish JB's and his brother's many contributions to the company and the industrial landscape of Orillia, but without the foundation put down by their father, I doubt the Tudhope Carriage Company and all its offshoots would have flourished in the same way. With the arrival of the 20th century, automobile production became somewhat of a craze across North America, with countless designers and entrepreneurs wanting to get in on the ground floor. In Orillia, the Tudhope Carriage Company, now under the leadership of JB, seen here, had been producing high-quality horse-drawn vehicles for more than a generation, and as I mentioned earlier, marketing them through its extensive sales network. Like many other industrialists, JB investigated the possibility of using an American design in a car built for the Canadian market. In those years, there were high tariffs on automobiles imported from the USA, so it paid to produce cars on Canadian soil. In 1908, in Oshawa, JB's good friend and competitor in the carriage trade, Sam McLaughlin, was manufacturing Buicks for the Canadian market, and established in 1904, the Ford Motor Company of Canada was thriving in Walkerville near Windsor. In a wider perspective, in the first half of the 20th century, automobiles were built in communities across the province, including Chatham, Tilbury, Woodstock, London, Kitchener-Waterloo, Stratford, Barrie, Penetanguishene, Toronto, Brockville, Kingston, Mount Bridges, Cambridge, and numerous others. Here's an example of one of the very first McLaughlins, which, when it was in the hands of its original family, and this picture was taken in Coldwater, and it shows a 1908 first year of production for McLaughlin 4-cylinder model. And here's a 1918 Bell made just down the road in Barrie. Incidentally, this car was restored from almost nothing to exactly the way it came from the family. Kudos to the team of people who made that resurrection possible. Finally, here we see a 1906 Russell made in Toronto by CCM. Yes, the same people that makes bicycles, skates, and other sports equipment. And yet they made cars from 1905 to 1915, catering to high-end customers. In September 1908, the Orillia Packet and Times reported that a Tudhope automobile was being tested and demonstrated. Combining mechanical components purchased from the W.H. McIntyre Company of Auburn, Indiana, with Tudhope bodies, fenders, wheels, and trim, the first Orillia-built cars, known as Tudhope McIntyres, were soon available for the automobile-hungry public. With high buggy-type wheels and simple body design, they closely resembled horse-drawn carriages, but their 2-cylinder air-cooled engines, double-chain drive, and wheel steering meant owners could drive their vehicles down the road without the help of the traditional horse. This particular example, now in the collection of the Simcoe County Museum, was purchased new by a pair of bachelor brothers near Woodville, Ontario. Note the similarity to a Tudhope carriage. Even the color combination is the same. Production figures are lost, but in a few short months, Tudhope's produced a substantial number of these primitive automobiles, and they were marketed all across the country through the company's carriage sales network. Here's one that was bought new in Kelowna, BC, and it's now proudly displayed in that city's municipal museum. They had some prestigious early customers, including the Bell Telephone Company. Now, the story goes that Bell sent a pair of men to Orillia to learn how to operate the little truck and subsequently drive it back to Toronto. However, due to repeated mechanical problems along the way, it never completed that journey and was in fact shipped back to Orillia for repairs. And then it was sent to Toronto by train. In fact, the McIntyre design was primitive even for the time, and the quality control on the mechanical components imported from Indiana was at best sketchy. I say the metallurgy in the Tudhope McIntyre mechanical parts was on a par with old cheese, very susceptible to breakage. However, they must have assembled a bunch of Tudhope McIntyres in very short order. At least 8 of them have survived to this day. The one in the collection of the Simcoe County Museum is probably the only example that is currently operational, and here's a shot of it on a recent test run. In August of 1909, disaster struck when the factory burned to the ground, just as cars were being readied for the CNE Automotive Show. The fire started in the paint shop and quickly spread to the rest of the factory, which was almost entirely constructed of wood. Hours after it started, there was nothing left. Undaunted, JB immediately began planning the construction of a new factory to produce carriages and automobiles. Within weeks, the work began and the building was completed in remarkably short order. And you will know this building, which still stands as Orillia City Hall, and there are condos and Lakehead University classrooms and other things that are accommodated here. In the meantime, JB investigated arrangements with other American automobile companies. He knew that the McIntyre design was outdated and would quickly lose public appeal. Soon he contracted with the Metzger Motor Car Company of Detroit, Michigan, to build a Canadian version of its Everett 30. Byron Everett, a Canadian who went to Detroit to make his fortune, and did, and seen here on the left, and super salesman William Metzger, here on the right, were the principals of the Metzger Company, and at the time, they were as well known in Detroit and beyond as Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers. For his part, JB was a highly regarded Canadian industrialist, the head of arguably the largest carriage manufacturing company in the country, maybe even the British Empire. From all accounts, he was an honest and progressive businessman, well respected by his employees and the wider community. Not afraid to step up to the plate, he served at various times as Reeve and Mayor of Orillia, Member of Provincial Parliament, and Member of Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. His home on the corner of Tecumseh and Peter Streets was state-of-the-art for its time and still stands today as Tudhope Manor, a home for seniors. JB was not a man to do anything by halves, and this time he intended to build automobiles in their entirety, rather than relying on American parts. To this end, he established the Tudhope Motor Company as a separate entity, purchased state-of-the-art machinery, and looked to build a team of men with experience in the automotive industry. Using the Everett design, Tudhope cast engine blocks, cut gears, stamped out frame rails, built bodies, and assembled everything into high-quality machines. The new models, which began to come off the line for the 1911 model year, were known as Everett 30s, but sales materials pointed out the many special Tudhope features that added to their value. With 4-cylinder water-cooled engines, magneto-ignition, and 3-speed transmissions, they included some of the best ideas in automotive engineering in an era when the automobile was in a constant state of evolution. I'm sure you would agree that this illustration from the 1911 Tudhope sales catalog is a pretty amazing piece of art. Canadian automotive companies employed top-line artists to do their catalog illustrations. In fact, some members of the famous Group of Seven did this kind of work in their day jobs. And we'll show you another illustration from their competitors, McLaughlin. So here's one from the 1913 McLaughlin catalog, and it's been said that it was probably done by either Franklin Carmichael or Tom Thompson, but don't hold me to it. Back to the Everett, here's a more clinical look at the 1911 standard touring. Note the lack of front doors. Front doors, or four doors, F-O-R-E doors, as they were called, only started coming into fashion about 1911. And you should know that the vast majority of automobiles produced by any company at this time were what we might call convertibles today. This one's a touring. If it were a 2-passenger, it would be a roadster. Now here is a closed model. It was called their coupe, and it looks to me rather like a china cabinet on wheels. By early 1912, a sleek and powerful 6-cylinder 648, or that means 48 horsepower, was added to the line, and in all models, body and fender design showed the beginnings of streamlining. So I'd like to show you a few details of the 1912 436 in the collection of the Orillia Heritage Center. You will see that the trim is nickel-plated, which eliminated the need to polish brass. The switch from brass to nickel really started about this time, 1911, with most manufacturers adopting it by the end of 1912. The exception was the Model T, which carried on a couple more years until the 1917s came out. I love the design of the rear window in the car, which was unique to Tudhope's. The headlights burned acetylene gas, while the side and taillights used kerosene. And you can see here the little V-shaped jet in the interior of the headlight. And if you're wondering what the gear system is in the background, that drives the speedometer. Now, there are people who look at the car and get a big question mark over their heads and then ask, is this car front-wheel drive? Anyway, it's not. The engine casting was an amazing piece of design. The exhaust manifold was integral with the block. There was no detachable cylinder head. Pistons and connecting rods were removed or installed from the bottom. Valves were accessed through those black ports along the top of the block. And the wires are going to a magneto, which provided the ignition. The upholstery was beautiful, all done in diamond tufted leather. Look at the door panels. They're elaborately trimmed to match the seats. And again, unique to Tudhope. No other car had that. The future looked rosy, but in mid-1912, and without notice, the American parent company went through a complete reorganization and was soon swallowed up by United States Motor Company, a large automotive conglomerate designed to compete with the recently formed General Motors and the skyrocketing Ford Motor Company. The business arrangement with Tudhope was terminated, and American production of the Everett 30 ceased. It also meant the end of research and development for the Tudhope Motor Company, because it depended on the Metzger Company for those services. Left on its own, the Orillia operation carried on with the cars rebadged as Tudhopes. By 1913, the cars were equipped with electric lighting, eliminating the need to fiddle with acetylene and kerosene lamps. The six-cylinder cars also had electric start. However, sales were slipping because of quickly aging engineering and competition from lower-priced vehicles such as the Model T Ford. Furthermore, it wasn't easy to find workers with automotive or machining experiences. There were challenges in producing sufficient numbers of cars with a largely unqualified staff. That lady in the car on the right looks pretty happy with her Tudhope. Later that year, in 1913, the Tudhope Motor Company was taken over by Frank Fisher and a group of investors, establishing Fisher Motors. Sales offices were located in Walkerville, but the cars were still built in the plant in Orillia. Essentially, Fishers were rebadged Tudhopes with a few cosmetic tweaks. It's unknown how many cars they actually put together. One story says they simply used up existing parts, but there are no records indicating production numbers. Unfortunately, sales continued to be weak, and by early 1914, the end was near. The advent of World War I marked the end of automobile production in Orillia, with remaining parts being used for ambulances bound for European battlegrounds. During the war years, Tudhope and Fisher, like many other manufacturers across the province, turned their attention to producing munitions like this gun shell. There's only one remaining Fisher that we know about, and I'm happy to report that it has recently been acquired by Orillia Heritage through the generous financial support of Gary Potter, an antique automobile enthusiast and collector who lives near Oro Station. Once again, my family has involvement in this car's history. Earlier, I mentioned that my dad owned the local radio station. In the early 1950s, he and a young announcer, Pete McGarvey, hosted a weekly program called Motor Memories. They'd banter back and forth about bits and pieces of automotive history, and at the end of each program, one of them would say, "And if you know of any antique cars in your neighborhood, please write to us." And the letters poured in, including one that led Dad to find the Fisher sitting outside in a backyard in Wingham, Ontario. And this is what it looked like the day he brought it home. He never got around to restoring it, but in about 1960, he did remove the motor so a crack in the water jacket could be repaired. To make a long story somewhat shorter, in about 1983, he sold the Fisher to our good friend Stan Passfield, who is a local retired music teacher and musician. This picture was taken the day the deal was completed. Stan's a very good mechanic, and he performed a thorough restoration of the car's chassis and engine. He never got as far as restoring the body and fenders. In 2006, he sold the project to Dr. Michael Francis, who took a few more steps toward completing the restoration, but mostly it remained in storage until his death just less than a year ago. When the estate was being settled, Orillia Heritage was able to buy the Fisher project, again, thanks to Gary Potter's donation. And this is how it looked the day that we bought it. The leather upholstery was in tatters, very corroded original paint on the body. The chassis has been restored and was, basically in running condition, but still a lot of work to do. This is how it looks now. We have a team of 4 guys, all members of Orillia Heritage, who typically get together at least once a week to work on it. In addition, we have several skilled craftsmen from the wider community assisting with woodworking, electrical stuff, and paint work. We're pretty happy with the progress we're making, but we need to continue to raise money to support the project. Right now, we want to get finished paint on the body so we can deal with the upholstery. A fellow named Wayne Shepard, who lives in Belleville, he's an antique car guy, has donated the money to pay for the leather and other materials for the upholstery, and local upholstery guru Rod Barkey and his brother Ron have offered to do the work at no cost. Bottom line is we're delighted to have the Fisher stay in Orillia, and we hope to have the restoration completed in the next year or two. It hasn't been on the road since 1926, and it's been partially or completely apart since 1960, so it's high time for it to be completed. And not to compete with the interests of the Orillia Museum of Art and History, but if there were any financial donations that could come our way, we would be very, very appreciative. Getting back to Tudhope and kind of going back a few years, they maintained production of horse-drawn vehicles, although with declining sales as more and more people made the switch to automobiles. Again, to back up, J.B. Tudhope purchased several other carriage-making operations in Ontario, including McLaughlin in Oshawa and Canada Carriage in Brockville, shown here. He organized them into a company called Carriage Factories Limited. It was a relatively short-lived venture, winding down as horse-drawn vehicles fell out of favor with consumers. After the war, through a branch called Orillia Bodies, Carriage Factories Limited continued an involvement in the automotive industry through manufacturing bodies for a number of marques, including Overland, Essex, Yellow Cab, and Brooks. There was even an occasional custom body design and built, including one for a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. Here are a couple of shots of Brooks steamers with Orillia bodies. These cars were made in Stratford. The body was constructed mostly of wood and covered with a material that looked like leather. Now, this wasn't a normal feature of Orillia bodies. They were just simply building the bodies to supply to Brooks using the Brooks design. I'll also say that the Brooks steam motors was a bit of a a bit of a financial scam, but that's a whole different story. Fisher Motors, in their part of the plant, made a broad range of automotive accessories and also developed an innovative ice cream scoop, which proved to be an excellent seller. It was available in a wide range of sizes for both domestic and commercial use. I would guess that there are many people watching this production tonight, a presentation, who may remember using a similar ice cream scoop, perhaps not knowing that it was locally designed and produced. In 1928, Fisher Motors and the Tudhope Carriage Company were folded into a new entity, Tudhope Metal Specialties. Still later, it became known simply as Tudhope Specialties. J.B. Tudhope died in 1936, turning the reins of the company over to his son, William Oliver, or W.O. Tudhope, who had served with distinction in World War I. With a hiatus during World War II when the plant made Piat anti-tank shells, the company produced a wide range of sheet metal and electrical products. And just one more word about the war years. It's interesting to note that the plant was largely staffed by women during that time. So I'd like to show you a few examples of Tudhope Specialties products. So here's a fancy folding tray, all nicely chrome plated. They also made a line of stoves and heaters, and here's one of their stoves. And a toy stove. Now, can you imagine the field day modern safety advocates would have for a toy that would get hot enough to bake a cupcake or fry an egg? And here's an electric heater. And finally, a pretty sleek looking trash can. Now they build all kinds of things. This is just a small sample. In the immediate post-war era, Tudhope Specialties was struggling. A few years previously, W.O.'s daughter, Dorothy, married Jack Spencer, shown here, a New Brunswick native who served as a flight instructor, training Allied pilots from all over the world. Jack joined the Tudhope management team and played a pivotal role in making the company profitable once again. W.O. passed away in 1963. Jack sold the company to Lear Siegler in 1968, and in 1974, it was sold again, this time to Hunter Enterprises. The Tudhope family helped found several other companies, including the Orillia Tudhope Anderson Company, later known as Otaco, Canada Electric Castings, Standard Chemical of Longford, Tools and Hardware, and Canada Wood Specialties, a large woodworking factory. Along with other companies such as E. Long, later Dorr Oliver Long, Faralloy, which is now Kubota, Oliver Machinery, and numerous others, large and small, Orillia became the most significant industrial city in Canada north of Toronto. In the earliest days, people and goods were mostly transported by boat, but that mode of transportation was soon replaced by railroads. With a network of rail lines passing through Orillia, Grand Trunk, Canadian Pacific, Canadian National, Midland Railway, and numerous other smaller or short-lived lines ran through here. Orillia also had its own power generation and distribution system, and in fact, the generation system is still locally owned and controlled by Orillia Power. But anyway, This shows the powerhouse at Ragged Rapids when it was under construction. But anyway, having a source of power allowed the city to offer electricity at reasonable rates to manufacturers. So there were a lot of neat things that have been made in Orillia over the years. And here's one. So take a look at this. It's called an Eaton Vanishing Motor Camp. The Eatons were lumber people, not to be confused with the people of department store fame, who had a shop on Andrew Street across from Tudhope's. It is there this amazing vehicle would have been built using a 1926 Rio automobile chassis. The big canvas tent could be folded down and stashed in a compartment in the back of the vehicle. It's recognized worldwide as being one of the very first RVs. In fact, Winnebago tried to buy it a number of times from the Sauter family, who have owned it for almost 70 years. There were a lot of very ingenious people at work in Orillia's industrial community back in those days. Over a 30-year period, Orillia Heritage gathered up a collection of locally manufactured items. Recently, we donated almost everything to the Simcoe County Museum, but I'd like to show you some pictures of a few of the more than 500 artifacts that we acquired. So here's from Tools and Hardware, a nice bathroom fixture. A porcelain and metal door push bar, P&M, also located in the Tudhope plant, made thousands of these for customers who wanted to promote their wares. Highly collectible nowadays, they provided very effective advertising for pop, cigarettes, clothing, newspapers, fuel, and much more. Here's a beaver boat made by Dominion Enterprises, and it's sitting on an Otaco trailer. Anyway, this is one example of the many different types of boats built on or near Orillia's waterfront. Other boat makers included Hunter, Ross, and Egloff. The world-famous ditchburn boats that we normally think of as coming from Muskoka were initially built here before moving up there. And Dean built racing canoes and paddles, and also paddles were made out at the Narrows by Mr. Harris of Harris Boat Works. Here's an Otaco mini toy tanker. After World War II, Otaco was left with a large inventory of sheet metal. A clever engineer in the plant got the idea of building toys. They were an overnight sensation. Boys from all across the country were delighted to get a mini toy, and these days, those mini toys are eagerly sought by collectors throughout North America and beyond. And I might add, in Christmas of 1956, I received my own Otaco mini toy tanker, but it was an Esso, an Imperial Esso, not a BA. Canada Wood Specialties made this cute toy. Mostly, they produced broomsticks, golf tees, cheese boxes, munitions crates, handles for Fisher and Tudhope ice cream scoops, and a whack of other wood products. It was a going concern, that factory, which was located where Metro is now. This is a Haywood Wakefield school desk and chair. And I, for one, spent many a classroom period sitting in a desk just like this at ODCVI. However, this one's a little different because there are no names or rude messages written or scratched onto the surface. ferroalloy mine scraper. This is a model of the real thing, which would have been ginormous. Ferroalloy and Longs supplied machinery to the mining industry throughout the country and beyond. This is an Otako auto track. In the 30s through the 50s, you could buy a kit to convert a passenger car to a simple tractor, and many cash-strapped farmers did just that. And these primitive little workhorses were able to help with routine farm chores. I've driven the one on the right and can report that it was a bone-jarring experience, but on the brighter side, my fillings are firmly ensconced in my teeth, so that's a good thing. And a final example, and I mean, I could have shown you, like 420 other things, but anyway, a baseball bat. Employees from Roland Boats, located on the waterfront, whiled away the winter hours turning out bats like this. Not sure they ever made it to the big league, though. In conclusion, I'd like to circle back to the Tudhope Motor Company. In 1910, when J.B. Tudhope was looking for a car to build, he partnered with Barney Everett and William Metzger, two giants in the Detroit automotive scene at the time. He built a state-of-the-art plant, looked to hire the most skilled staff possible, and produced gorgeous cars. It should have been a recipe for success. However, the wheels fell off when the Metzger Motor Company disappeared, leaving Tudhope's Orillia operation on its own. We have no idea who all JB might have approached as a potential partner, but suppose he'd made an arrangement with, well, maybe the Dodge brothers to build their car here. Who knows? Orillia could still be a powerhouse in the automotive industry. And about Sam McLaughlin and his company, which led to General Motors of Canada, well, frankly, he was incredibly lucky that he happened to hitch himself to a winner. The next time you see Orillia Heritage's Tudhope or Fisher automobiles, take a moment to imagine our city as Detroit of the North, and also to pay tribute to William Tudhope and his family for their many contributions to Orillia's proud industrial heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for giving us that talk today. It was really informative, and we appreciate all of your experience and all of the knowledge that you shared with us. Were the early cars right and or left-hand drives?
They were virtually all right-hand drive until the Model T Ford came out in 1909. And then it was left-hand drive, and gradually cars switched over to left-hand drive. And really by 1915, they were pretty much all left-hand drive.
Okay, thank you. And another one here. How dangerous is it to hand crank a Tudhope?
Well, it's really not dangerous at all, as long as you remember to change the ignition timing. We call it retard the spark, so that it won't kick back on you. But if you forget to do that, it could kick back and it could break your wrist or break your arm or whatever.
And then another one here in the chat is, John, you are a car collector. Just wondering, how many antique cars do you own?
I own two. But I grew up in an antique car family where my dad would have up to 50 antique cars at a time. And over the years, he had close to 400 cars.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Were those all off-site that he kept them at, or personal property or?
Oh, he had them here and there. He had
That's quite a number.
a storage building and other rented garages and so on. Anyway.
And another one here. Oh, a few more. Do you know why they changed from right to left?
Okay. Well, in the early days, when there was no traffic, um, it made sense for them to copy what was happening in the United Kingdom and in Europe, where the cars were right-hand drive. Um, so, with no traffic, it was probably more important to keep an eye for the driver to keep an eye on the ditch at the side of the road. But then, as there got to be more traffic, it was really better that the driver be able to gauge, the distance between his car and any oncoming vehicles. So I think that's the reason why. And actually, just for your information, in British Columbia and in Nova Scotia and maybe New Brunswick and PEI as well, they drove on the left side of the road until the mid to late teens before they moved over.
Okay, that's great to know. And then a few more questions popped up here. So, did Tudhope cars have shock absorbers?
Well, they had what they called shock absorbers, which was they had a coil spring that was fastened to each side of the frame, like there's one on each side of the frame at the back. And then they had a leather strap that went from that spring down below the rear axle. And supposedly that helped things when they went over big bumps. Frankly, I don't think it made a hill of beans difference, but anyway, it was a good selling point.
Yeah. And I have a comment here. John, I recall from my youth that your father owned a wide collection of cars, including some built in Orillia. Which locally built cars have you been part of your or your family's collection?
Okay, well, we owned the 1909 Tudhope McIntyre that is now in the collection of the Simcoe County Museum. He had a 1911 Everett chassis. He had the 1912 Tudhope Touring that was shown in the first slide. And he also owned the Fisher.
Okay. And another comment here, can you talk a bit more about the Orillia Heritage Center? Is it a physical place we can go visit and see the cars in the process of being restored?
Well, now there's a great question. So we're a charitable corporation, and the name of our corporation is the Orillia Heritage Center. And initially, it was set up in 1986, and initially there was a thought, well, there were plans to build a museum to showcase the cars and all the various Orillia made products, but that never happened, and so we really don't have a center. Our Tudhope car was on display in the foyer of City Hall, but then they made some renovations and they booted us out. I'd like to put it more politely, but that's really what happened. And anyway, it's unfortunate because people still say to us, "What happened to the car in City Hall?" Well, anyway. So no, we don't have a center where you can really, just know that you can come and see the car or cars. We also own the 1923 American LaFrance fire truck, which was the first motorized fire truck for the city. And it's on display in the fire hall on Gill Street. So that is one thing, one of our vehicles that is available to the public to take a look at. But really, on a personal note, if you want to see the cars or come and see the Fisher Project and so on, get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to make those arrangements.
And another question. I understand that Orillia Heritage Center, comment, I should say. I understand that Orillia Heritage Center's Tudhope car was used in the Murdoch mysteries.
It was, yeah, just a couple of weeks ago, and it appeared in a movie about what was that one about? Actually, the picture was, I used the slide tonight. Anyway, yeah, it's been featured a few times.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah.
Another one here. How much did a Tudhope car cost?
About $2,500, which was a lot of money when in 1912 you could have bought a Model T in Canada for, maybe 950 or something like that. So, so really, you might say that a Model T was like a Toyota Corolla, and a Tudhope was maybe like an upscale Buick or something like that.
That is quite significant at the time. And then, are there any plans for a Tudhope museum in Orillia? I don't know if you can answer that.
Well, we have a dream. And we have a dream that wouldn't it be nice to have a carriage house on the property out at the Leacock Museum, in keeping with the boathouse and with the Leacock House itself, in which we could display our cars.
Thank you all for all your wonderful questions here and comments. Okay, maybe a last one here. Was the Fisher Carriage Company associated with the Fisher Company, which took over Tudhope?
Oh, you mean Fisher Bodies? I imagine that's what you're referring to. And no, there was no association at all. Different Fisher families entirely.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you for listening to tonight's presentation.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.